In our last video, in verses 4 and 5, we talked about Jesus giving a promise to his apostles to give them the Holy Spirit. Now that brings us to verse 6. So when they had come together, they asked him, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" Now we aren't told all the specifics, but there must have been something that tipped the apostles off to the importance and the finality of this meeting with Jesus. Their question reveals that there was an expectation in the air. They asked him if he was ready to, quote, restore the kingdom to Israel. And what exactly did they mean by that? Well, the Old Testament Jewish prophets, they had spoken of a day that God would restore his people. But what kind of restoration were they talking about? As we discussed in our Gospel of Luke study, many of the Jews seemed to think that the Messiah was coming back to initiate a political and an economic restoration. They thought that the Messiah was going to cast off the rule of the Roman Empire and to make the Jews prominent again among the nations, maybe even the greatest nation in all the world. And this was probably what the apostles were referring to when they asked about this restoration in verse 6. Jesus had already informed them that his work on earth was almost complete, and they probably thought, well, it's now or never. Now let's look at Jesus' response in verses 7 and 8. And he said to them, "It is not for you to know times or seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." Jesus' answer in verse 7 implied that it wasn't the time for the restoration of the Jews, at least not in the sense that the apostles had in mind. Jesus told them that, yes, God had a plan for the nations, which he refers to as times and seasons. God was working in the world, but that plan wasn't going to be shared with the apostles. And Jesus may have taken this language of times and seasons from Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, where Daniel writes, "He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings." So Jesus told the apostles that God had a plan, but it was not immediately relevant to the work that he was going to give them to do. All they needed to concern themselves with was his instructions in verse 8. They were going to receive power from the Holy Spirit, and they were to use that power to be Jesus' witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. They wanted to know about the future of Israel and the Jews, and maybe their part in all of that. But interestingly, Jesus gave them a mission that included all of the nations, whether they knew it in that moment or not. They were given the responsibility of being the witnesses of Jesus' life. And no one was better equipped for that role. No one was better acquainted with Jesus. But the Bible's also clear that just their close association with Jesus wasn't enough. The Holy Spirit's power was a necessary ingredient for them to fulfill this mission. And when the Holy Spirit empowered them, they were to tell everybody about Jesus' words, the events of his life, his resurrection, everything. And they were to, quote, make disciples of all nations, according to Matthew chapter 28, 18 through 20. So that's verses 6 through 8. And then, beginning in verse 9, we will talk about Jesus' ascension as he finally goes back to heaven now that his ministry on earth is complete.